Hello everybody, I'm here with you at the Battle of Guilford Courthouse National Military Park, speaking with you about the Atlantic slave trade. Before we proceed, I'd like to have you take a guess of what percentage of all the slaves that were brought from Africa to the New World, what percentage of them came to what is now the United States, which for part of that period, of course, would have been the British colonial period. So just have that guess in mind. It's important to understand that the Atlantic slave trade was a crucial part of New World development. It's not just some sort of side note on the history of the New World and its social, economic development. For every European that came over during the period of the slave trade, there were 4 Africans that came over. Of course, mostly against their will, nearly all of them against their will. And, many different societies participated in this, especially Western European countries that had colonies in the New World. And the Portuguese were actually the leading group in this. In terms of slaves that were brought to the New World, the Portuguese led the way overall, followed by the British and the French. And indeed, the answer to your percentage question is only about 5 to 6% of all the slaves that were brought to the New World were brought to what's now the United States. So many other areas were impacted in a more concentrated way than even was the United States. Brazil being the country, modern day country that had the most slaves, but in the Caribbean regions where you had a much higher percentage of the people that were slaves that were living in these colonies. Now, slavery had existed in Africa previous to European contact. Of course, slavery existed in many societies throughout the world previous to European contact. But slavery in Africa tended to be a little bit different than what we saw in the New World slavery. That in Africa, in many cases, slaves were taken as a result of warfare, and the captives were then taken as slaves. But it was not always a temporary situation, and it was not quite as economically motivated. And in many cases, some of the slaves were actually incorporated into the society of their enslavers. But as far as the Atlantic slave trade goes, when you think of the actual capturing of slaves, that was generally done by Africans. As historian Paul Lovejoy reminds us that Africans did not enslave their brothers, rather they enslaved their enemies. And that was true in a period when there was slavery before European contact and afterward. They often took the slaves from people that were not among their tribal or ethnic group. So after the slaves were captured, they generally were brought to these forts along the coast where they were, in fact, sold to Europeans. So as far as the real true slave trade period from the 1500s to the mid-1800s, yes, the demand was driven by the Europeans, and they certainly take the lion's share of the blame for this horrendous period in history. Now, when they were trading with these African merchants, what was happening is, in a lot of cases, the African merchants and kings along the coast, they were the ones that were really sort of dictating the terms of the trade. In some cases, the local king would insist that he would sell the slaves that he was going to get a portion of the profits for initially, before allowing others to do so. And so that's kind of how it developed along the coast. Over 12.5 million slaves were taken from Africa to the New World. Just staggering numbers. Of those, about 10.7 million made it across. These are estimates, and they're hotly contested, but these are roughly accurate estimates based on a lot of research by a lot of different scholars. There were over 35,000 documented voyages of ships that brought slaves over to the New World in this period. as far as the sort of legacy of the slave trade among Africans, Robin Law has done a book. It's called Ouida, and it's about the slaving port in Ouida, which is a place which is now in the West African country of Benin. And he finds among the people that they don't really try to deny any sort of complicity in the slave trade, that their ancestors certainly participated in the slave trade, and even for instance, when the French were colonizing, this is after the slave trade had been abolished in France. As the French were colonizing in Benin, they were going to knock down some of their old slaving forts. And the people of Benin in these villages said no, they didn't want that to happen, because they recognized it as a part of their history, as a part of the history of Africa and of the Atlantic world. So there's certainly complicity to go all around, but certainly the European demand is what made it such a horrendous and widespread situation, with so many numbers of people being brought over to the New World as slaves. We will talk about the other conditions after this plane flies over. No, but we'll also talk about the Middle Passage, and that'll be in a separate video. Bye for now.